Why did I think that? Well, if you've ever been to a commercial gym, the only thing bigger than the juiced up powerlifter grunting in the corner is usually the ego of the half reppers on the bench press. G'day guys, my name's Nick and this is Nicktrition. In today's video, I want to talk to you about failure and how it can help you grow. But don't worry, I haven't thrown the towel in on fitness and decided to become a life coach. I want to talk about how training closer to failure can help you grow muscle. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you how to apply this principle to your home workouts to help you grow more muscle at home. But first, let's roll the theme tune. Muhammad Ali was once asked by a reporter how many sit-ups he can do. And his response was, "I don't count my sit-ups. I only start counting once it starts hurting." And maybe he was onto something. You see, the concept of effective reps is definitely not new. In fact, Arnold Schwarzenegger had this to say about it.
And go on and go on. And this last 2 or 3 or 4 repetitions, that's what makes actually the muscle then grow. And that divides then one from a champion and one from not being a champion.
Now, it seems like athletes at the top of their game have been aware of effective reps for quite some time. But should you really take their word for it? Like anything, there are some studies out there that support the effective rep theory, and there are some studies out there that disprove the effective rep theory. And the effective rep theory is essentially what Arnold was talking about, that the closer you get to failure, or as I like to call it, the proximity to failure, the more chance you have to grow muscle. The reason I think this is a pretty sound theory is the way muscle fibers work when you start lifting a load. The first rep of any set of pretty much any exercise is going to be the easiest relative to all the subsequent reps. And the reason for this is because you're not fatigued yet. When you first pick up a weight, your brain quickly assesses how many motor units and muscle fibers it's going to take to perform a full rep of this exercise. It will then recruit those muscle fibers, you perform the rep, you might perform a couple of reps, and the more reps you perform, the more fatigued those muscle fibers get. And as muscle fibers fatigue, the brain tells other muscle fibers to turn on. And this keeps happening as you keep going through reps, muscle fibers fatigue, new muscle fibers get turned on, all the way until you no longer have any muscle fibers to recruit to substitute fatigued muscle fibers. And this is likely the point that Arnold and Muhammad were talking about. From this point, your reps are likely to get slower and harder and probably hurt more each rep until you can no longer perform a full repetition with proper technique. This is what people refer to when they talk about training to failure. It is likely that at the point your reps start to slow down, if your effort is still high, this is also the point where your reps are the most effective because you've recruited and applied tension to all of the available muscle fibers. Awesome, so every set you need to train to failure. End of video, goodbye. Not really. Actually, it's a bit more nuanced than that. You see, if you train to failure every set, you're going to really struggle to recover for the next set and also for the next session. You see, recovery is also a pretty important part of muscle growth because the quicker you can recover, the quicker you can train that muscle group again. So to do this, we need to get close to failure, but not all the way to failure. Well, not all the time anyway. One way people do this is by using what's known as reps in reserve. Now, reps in reserve is simply a way to measure proximity to failure. It's how many reps you have until you hit failure. It can be quite difficult for people who are new to training or new to training this close to failure to accurately predict their reps in reserve or their RIR. And this is because they just don't have the experience of getting close to failure and learning what it feels like to either fail or what it feels like just before they fail. A 2018 study found that subjects were actually better at predicting their RIR the further they got into their session. So the more sets they did, the better they were at predicting their reps in reserve. And this is likely for a couple of reasons. One reason is they were probably getting pretty used to the exercise, and each set they were getting close to failure and starting to understand, right, okay, I probably could have done 1 or 2 more reps in that set, and then they try it, and then they think, well, probably could have done 1 or 2 reps again, and the more sets you do, the closer you actually get to finding out where failure is, and therefore your ability to predict how close you are to failure improves. Another reason for this could just be that the more sets they did that were close to failure, the less reps they were doing per set, because obviously your muscles start to fatigue, you have lower glycogen storage, and things like failure start to become closer and closer, and if you just perpetually did set after set, eventually you would get to the point where you could no longer exceed, a small number of reps. I think though that the biggest reason is just a general inexperience in predicting the number of reps for a certain exercise with a certain amount of weight. For example, in a 2017 study, 160 men were asked how much weight they thought they could bench press for 10 reps, and then they were asked to prove it. To my surprise, when I was actually reading this study, every single participant exceeded 10 reps with the weight that they had predicted. This leads me to believe that the subjects in this study were relatively untrained. Why did I think that? Well, if you've ever been to a commercial gym, the only thing bigger than the juiced up powerlifter grunting in the corner is usually the ego of the half-reppers on the bench press. Interestingly enough, not only did all 160 participants in the study exceed the 10 reps, over 50% exceeded 15 reps, and over a quarter of them exceeded 20 reps. That means about a quarter of the participants in this study were actually able to do double what they predicted. So normally when I start talking to people about proximity to failure, this is when they'll start asking questions like,
so how many reps do I do per set?
And
how many reps should I stop before failure?
And I'd love to answer those questions right after a message from my sponsor. It's just me. I'm sponsoring my own video. Please subscribe. So while I'm quite happy to answer these questions, it might be better to hear the answer from a real doctor who studied this sort of stuff. So this is a quote from Dr. Mike Israetel from the Revive Stronger podcast, answering one of these questions.
So I think we need a bit more research, and I'll say this. It is true that the closer you get to failure, the more hypertrophic yield each repetition creates. But that's not really a hard cutoff like 6RAR still grows muscle. Probably has what's called an S-curve. Looks like an S on its side. So for really like 15 reps from failure, you have very little growth. And then getting to around 5 reps to failure, you have this inflection point of where growth starts to really go up. What does that mean? That means that training with 4 reps in reserve versus 5 reps in reserve is probably a pretty big difference for hypertrophy. Training with 3 reps in reserve versus 4 reps in reserve is a big difference. Training with 2 reps in reserve versus 3 reps is a decent difference, but nothing crazy. Training with 1 rep in reserve versus 2 reps in reserve is probably a small difference. Training with true failure versus 1 rep in reserve is probably a very small difference.
So to put it simply and bring this back to something I said earlier, your effective reps probably start when your reps start to slow down but your effort remains high, and that range probably continues all the way up until failure. But as we discussed, you don't want to hit failure because you want to recover for the next set or the next session. That means that the point where you should finish your set is probably somewhere between full muscle fiber recruitment and failure. And as Dr. Mike said, there's a law of diminishing returns, which means that those first few reps in that range are probably going to have more bang for your buck than these last few really close to failure. And to answer the other question of how many reps should you do per set, I would say the answer is probably somewhere between 5 and 30. But why? Well, because as I mentioned earlier, the more reps you do per set, the harder it is to estimate your proximity to failure. There is also an upper limit of around about 30 reps per set, where the limiting factor in some people is no longer muscular fatigue, but cardiovascular fatigue. So for this reason, it's best to try and load your sets to a point where you can't actually complete more than 30 reps before hitting failure. And why is 5 reps a minimum? Well, 5 reps is probably the minimum because anything less than that is probably too few reps to have a significant amount of effective reps. So if you only do 3 reps and you start to slow down on the second rep or even the first rep, the maximum amount of effective reps you can get for muscle growth in that set is 3. Whereas if you went to, say, 10 reps and you started to slow down on rep 5, obviously you would then have 5 effective reps. Or if you went to 15 and you started to slow down on rep 9, you would have 6 effective reps. As you can see, somewhere in between 5 and 30 is going to be a sweet spot for you. And that sweet spot is probably going to be different for everybody based on a whole host of factors. This is where load comes in. If you start exceeding 30 reps per set on any movement, you can increase the load or introduce load, and this should bring your failure point below 30 reps per set. Likewise, if you can't hit 5 reps per set, then you might need to decrease the load so that you can get somewhere between that 5 and 30 rep range. So if you're working out at home and you're doing, say, sets of 50 squats, for example, you're probably not accurately estimating your proximity to failure. So it's probably best to grab hold of something, fill up a backpack with water bottles or books or anything heavy you got laying around, and increase your load to bring your failure point down to somewhere below 30. Likewise, if you're using push-ups or bodyweight rows or whatever the case may be, if you're exceeding 30, increase the load. If you're not exceeding 5, decrease the load. If you're already only using your body weight and you can't do more than 5 reps on something, then keep practicing. Over time, you'll get better and be able to perform more than 5 reps and find yourself in that 5 to 30 rep range. If you made it this far in the video, I want to say a massive thank you, and I really hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like me, please consider subscribing. Until next time, I've been Nick, this has been Nicktrition, and I'll see you in the next video.